Mishcon Academy digital sessions.
Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining this Mishcon Academy session, part of a series of online events, videos and podcasts looking at the biggest issues faced by businesses and individuals today. Today we're joined by Mary Beard, one of the country's most well-known historians and author of over 20 books, including the bestsellers SPQR and Women and Power, available here for those of you in the room today. We'll be discussing Mary's most recent book, Emperor of Rome, also available here today, which unpacks the fact and fiction of Roman emperors from Julius Caesar's dictatorship in 48 BCE to Alexander Severus' assassination in 235 BCE. So when many of us associate the Roman emperor with power, tyranny and license, why was it so important to you to insert a more human element in your book?
I think for them, the Roman Empire and the figure of the emperor is really about power. It's a kind of, if you say, why do people think about the emperor or the empire in that way? I think it's because it's a safe space to be macho. It's 2,000 years ago, so it doesn't matter very much. But the image, the fantasy, is about these kind of all-powerful blokes. And I suppose what I wanted to do was to prick that bubble a bit. Mm-hmm. I should say absolutely 100%. I despise one-man rule, autocracy. I don't have any sympathy for the emperor as a political institution. But I thought almost no one ever sees it the other way round. I think history is at its best, she says, I don't mean that boastfully, it's at its best when it tries to kind of flip things and see them a different way. And only if you have this kind of extraordinary view of Roman emperors, which is that they were over-the-top display artists who didn't have a moment of self-reflection. And that, it seems to me, for me, that moment is when you see the double bind of being an emperor. You're an ordinary guy. You're not very special. And you have to believe in yourself as ruling the Roman world. Now, I imagine that's not all that different for prime ministers or presidents or whatever. How do you believe in yourself as a figure of power? And so I found myself wanting all the time to think, not that I, as I said, not that I think that the system they were trying to uphold and did uphold was any good, but just a kind of personal level. What on earth was it like?
I thought it was interesting that you seek to do a bit of myth busting in your book, but you do also indulge a few of the myths, so that the book opens actually with Elagabus and his habit of releasing tame lions, leopards and bears amongst the hungover guests after a big party, which I'm sure they appreciated, and then smothering his guests with rose petals. There's a picture of that actually in the book, in the first page of the palette. It's amazing. So since you indulge these myths, what do you think they can actually tell us about the Roman emperor? I
think that you have to transcend the idea and the question of whether they're true or not, right? I mean, by and large, the stories that we hear and read and have become absolutely kind of part of the image of different emperors, by and large, those are told, we don't know when they originated, but they're told and written down after the death of the emperor concerned. And so the Roman Empire is an absolutely extreme example of history written by the victors. So what I try to think about, because I don't want to throw away the anecdotes, these kind of colourful anecdotes are what makes the Roman Empire terribly appealing. What are they telling us? Because these stories, true or not, they're told against a context in which they make sense, right? And they're told for a purpose. There are wonderful stories, like the one that Alma Tadema depicts in the 1880s. Guests go to dinner, and it's a trick that many emperors pulled. How do you show your generosity? Well, eventually you shower the guests with rose petals. The only trouble was that Elagabalus was too generous, and there were so many rose petals that they smothered and died. Right? It was murder. But the usual way of seeing that story is to say, oh, he's only a teenager. He is assassinated age 18. He's on the throne for 4 years, 14 to 18. Say, look, this is the kind of thing a capricious teenager on the throne does. He just kind of makes a mess of it. And that's partly what the story is about, I think. But it's also reaching to, I think, rather more important issues about how people reflected on Roman emperors and their power. It's partly saying, I think, when an emperor is generous, it can kill you. Emperors kill with kindness. That the emperor's generosity can be as dangerous to you as the emperor's threats and violence. And so in a funny way, I kind of find it, a rather sophisticated little vignette of how the emperor might operate. Why is the emperor dangerous? How do you feel? You're invited to dinner. Is that a scary, opportunity? Or is it the best invitation you've ever had in your life? Well, of course, it's both.
Yeah, life or death sometimes, it seems.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was an interesting part of the book, actually, the section about women and how, everything from their sexuality to their influence is just seen as a massive danger under one-man rule. Yet, in another way, they also have this newfound position at the forefront of the empire. So I was wondering if you could just talk a bit more about that and what the role was there for women.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that's easy to forget is that one of the biggest changes that you'd have seen from the old sort of democratic system in Rome to the new system after Julius Caesar of one-man rule is that you saw images of women in public. That if you walked through Rome in 75 BC, you'd have seen goddesses, and you might have seen a couple of mythical Republican early heroines of Rome. Otherwise, it's blokes only. If you go to 75 CE and you walked through Rome, the public space displays women. The wives, the sisters, the daughters, and the mothers of emperors. So the imperial family and that kind of dynastic, an investment in dynasty, that changes the visibility of women in the public sphere completely dramatically.
Yeah, you mentioned that we should ask Carrie Johnson some of the...
Exactly, because you've
got
the Carrie Johnson phenomenon. Because we know that the same would have gone for Cherie Blair or went for Nancy Reagan. The women who were associated with modern political leaders are also believed to, and probably do have, influence over the political leader, but they also are a kind of absolute lightning rod for misogyny. How do we explain the fact that President X made that stupid decision? Blame the wife, right? And we saw that very obviously with Johnson and the animals coming out of wherever it was, and so in a kind of broadly misogynistic world, the women are useful. They're useful people to blame, and they're useful explanatory tools when you don't really know what's going on.
At the very end of your book, you mentioned how the research has opened your eyes to the Roman Empire and that way of ruling, but also how it's opened your eyes to the modern political world. So it kind of got me thinking, how much of the then can we see in the now?
I think one always has to be careful about drawing too close and direct links. I mean, when Trump was president, the commonest question I got asked was, which Roman emperor is Mr. Trump most like, right? And
Which Roman emperor is Mr. Trump most like?
well, I tell you what I used to say. It depended how much time I had.
Okay.
If I had a lot of time, I'd say, now, let's sit down and think through that question, you know. And actually, probably not like any.
Yeah.
If I was busy, I would always say Elagabalus. Because I knew they wouldn't have heard of him.
Yeah,
There's a lot of pretend victories goes on in the Roman Empire. I mean, when you see all those statues of emperors in their battle skirts, that's partly a substitute for fighting, not a commemoration of it. You know, they dress up in military kit. Well, it's like our royals, don't they? They always get hundreds of medals. You know, actually they've not served in an active combat ever, right? But they still got all these medals because they're wanting to say, I have a military basis to my power. It also, a bit like the Elagabalus and the rose petal story, it's actually asking you to think about pretense, you know, authenticity. You know, is the emperor really a conqueror? And what if it is all a charade?
Assuming that sort of Roman emperors they're sort of linked, they've got a religious role that they play as well at the centre of the state. Is there any sort of evidence of how do you prepare to be an emperor, number one, and how do you prepare to be a living god? Because it's not really a manual, is it?
Look, you guys are asking really good questions, every single question, because those are absolutely homing in on two of the really, really difficult transition points. We have no clue how emperors were trained to be emperors. We have Marcus Aurelius, much more interesting than his rather kind of overrated meditations. We have letters between him and his tutor, Fronto, still surviving. And, you know, Fronto gives him a little bit of good practical advice, like, you know, don't play with your mobile phone when you're supposed to be watching the races, because he'd taken in his correspondence to do in the Circus Maximus. It did not go down well. It's a bit like, you know, William being caught texting during the cup final. And so, you know, there's a bit of kind of savvy advice. But otherwise, he is going through the kind of education we think it looks stultifying that elite Roman kids went through, you know, making up spoof speeches, you know, defend Romulus on the charge of murdering Remus, you know, etc. And we can only assume that they learned it on the job, and we can only assume that some of the people who are very important in that were the slaves and ex-slaves who are actually managing the show. So that's one big mystery. The other big mystery is what does it feel like to become a god, or to think you're going to become a god? You know, they joked about that. You know, when Vespasian dies, you know, he says, "Oh my goodness me, I think I'm becoming a god," right? Which was presumably a joke, not an observation. And you can do, and I talk about this in the book a bit. You can say, look, the boundary between God and man is much more fluid in the ancient world. That, you know, there's plenty of gods like Hercules who had started out life as mortals. So that transition is possible. It is still very hard to know how they thought about one day the emperor being a bit sick, then dying, and the next time having a temple and a load of priests. And Seneca, Nero's tutor, takes the piss out of that when he does a little skit about Claudius going up to heaven. And Claudius, you know, not the most kind of sprightly emperor, goes up to heaven, and the gods think, I don't really fancy you here, thank you very much. And they send him back down to hell. So they're puzzling about it too, I'd say.
Interesting, yeah. All I can say is that I hope I can summon some wit on my deathbed.
It's always invented afterwards, you know, so you don't have to.
I'll
somebody else will summon the wit for you.
So online, quite a nice one to finish with. Someone has a good reference here. Taking the Python view of what did the Romans ever do for us, which emperor left the biggest legacy and why?
I think it this is a really boring answer to a nice question. It has to be Augustus. Not only because we still live with Augustus, we live with Julius Caesar and Augustus in July and August. They named the months after themselves, and we still use it. But I think that there is no other place, there's one possible other place, where you can see the world changing in a way that lasted for centuries, except under Augustus. I suppose, my second place, I'd say the Emperor Caracalla, not a very nice piece of work, murdered his brother on his mother's knee. But in 212, he made every free person in the Roman Empire a Roman citizen, giving millions and millions of people citizenship. It probably counts as the biggest grant of citizenship to huge numbers of people ever in the history of the world. I mean, and it changes the balance between the insiders and the outsiders. It makes everybody an insider. They find other ways of making insiders soon, but essentially it has made everybody in the whole empire an insider. We have no idea why he did it, but it's a big change.
Yeah, no, it sounds huge. But yeah, thank you for coming in, Mary. Really interesting talk.
Thank you.
Shall we say thank you to...
The Mishcon Academy Digital Sessions. To access advice for businesses that is regularly updated, please visit mishcon.com.